temperature jumped 1.4 degrees. In the next, experts believe that number will soar as high as 11.5 degrees higher. A hotter planet means new challenges in securing the globe. Food and water will become scarce, and natural disasters will wreak havoc on government resources. The U.S. is getting ready, but it's not just the EPA spearheading efforts of climate reform. It's also the military, and on a global scale, governments continue to seek solutions that will mitigate the impact of climate change. The war on warming, next on Great Decisions. In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we explore today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Reuters Television. Sponsorship of Great Decisions is provided by ENI, the Hereford Foundation, and PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP.
Hello and welcome to Great Decisions. I'm your host, David Rode. The Earth is getting hotter, and with the rising temperatures come new perils. Natural disasters cause destruction, death, and the migration of populations. They also threaten food security. The world's leaders are looking for solutions, but they don't always agree. Here with me today to discuss climate change is Bjorn Lomborg. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
You're known as sort of a skeptic about global warming. Your latest book is How to Spend $75 Billion. It's looking at other ways to spend money that might go into a sort of radical approach to countering global warming. Do you think global warming is happening?
Yes, I think virtually everyone tells us there is global warming, it's partly man-made, and it is an important problem. What I'm skeptical about is partly these sort of very alarmist arguments, we're going to see the kind of end of the world, but also the way we try to tackle it, which has fundamentally for the last 20 years been incredibly inefficient policies that cost a lot and will do almost no good.
We're here in New York. There was record drought in the United States. Recently, we've had these superstorms. Hurricane Sandy devastated this city. Others would say this is happening right now. This is a huge threat, an immediate problem we should be devoting, billions of dollars to, and our leaders should be doing more.
Yep.
Are you sure this is not an immediate crisis?
Well, you're absolutely right. A lot of people would say, first of all, it's happening, and we should do something about it. Let me take both of those points. When the scientists look at, for instance, hurricanes and drought, they can't actually tell that it's changing just yet. Let's just remember there was a lot of drought in the 50s. There was much, much more drought in the 1930s in the US. And of course, we have data back to the 1200s that show there's mega drought for 6 decades. So while we have an idea that probably drought is going to get slightly worse by the end of the century, this is not what we're seeing now. And likewise, we haven't seen a higher than a Category 3 hurricane for 7 years, which is the longest the U.S. has ever seen that happen. So we got to remember, yes, hurricanes are going to hit, and they're also going to hit New York. But it's also then about what should you do, and that's where I worry about them saying we need to cut carbon emissions right now. If you want to safeguard New York, and I think that's a smart idea, you should put up simple things like wetland barriers. You should make sure you have caps for the subway so you don't flood your expensive subway system. There's lots of cheap and simple ways that you can tackle this problem that would do a lot more good for a lot more people much faster.
So there are physical barriers that would help, that would not necessarily cost so much, that might
Well, I mean,
do more.
the point, for instance, with Hurricane Sandy, it was mostly the fact that it was also a high tide, it was actually spring tide, and then it pushes in a lot of the water over New York. So if you could put up a wetland barrier outside, you had clam fisheries in late 1800s. Of course, they're all gone now, but if we could get those back in, the surge would not be nearly as big, and it would be virtually invisible. It would be very cheap. And it would be a simple way to tackle this issue. It's simple structures that makes it possible for you to deal with the problems that have always been there and that are going to be a little bigger with global warming.
Fracking. an energy miracle for the United States or an environmental disaster?
Well, I mean, I think there's two parts and lessons to be taken away from fracking. Partly, it emphasizes how good fossil fuels are for you. You've essentially made cheap fossil fuels available again from and produced in the U.S., and you have lots of manufacturing coming into the U.S. actually wanting to use that. But it's also actually been mostly an environmental benefit for the U.S.
Fracking has been an environmental benefit.
Remember that there are concerns. Yes, there are concerns, legitimate concerns about fracking. Everyone, I think, agrees that with proper regulation, you can actually get fracking to work. But we need to get that, and we're still trying to assess exactly
and what would that specifically
Well,
be?
it's about, for instance, people are very worried about fracking fluids getting into the drinking water. Remember, the fracking is miles below the ground. You're not interfering with it down here, but you are drilling through it. So you need to have caps around as you drill through the drinking water. And yes, there's probably been some companies that haven't done that very well. We know the technology. We've done this for half a century. So it's really a question of saying we want proper regulation. And we also, of course, want to make sure, for instance, it's probably mostly fracking fluid that you put down and afterwards, once you're done, that hasn't worked. And we probably need to just simply clean up that fracking fluid instead. But the fundamental point is those are things that we can solve and that we definitely ought to focus on how we solve. But remember, what fracking has also done is it's made gas much cheaper than coal.
And gas is much cleaner than
gas
coal.
burns about twice as clean as coal. That means you emit much less CO2. And so the phenomenal outcome is, if we just do the calculations based on the Energy Information Agency from the US, we estimate that the US, over the last 5 years, because of fracking, has reduced its carbon emissions more than what the rest of the world has managed to do over the last 20 years during Kyoto and all the stuff that the EU has done. Probably twice as much. So you've done twice as much good for global warming. And while the EU and others have probably paid about $60 billion a year to do this, you guys have made $125 billion a year because you've gotten cheaper energy.
And we haven't necessarily ruined the water supply in the process.
And listen, all technologies have problems. So we definitely need good regulation. But you have to remember, coal-fired power plants kill about 300,000 people each year. And wind turbines, these benign creatures, of course, both kill birds directly, but they also cost a lot of money, which actually means that's other resources you can't spend on, I don't know, hospitals or other good things in society. So let's remember, there's cost to everything. And so we just got to weigh it right, and we also got to ask ourselves, how do we then make the best regulation so fracking is the least problematic?
The world is getting warmer, and with the increasing temperatures comes increasing tensions over shrinking food supplies and dwindling natural resources. As climate patterns shift from one extreme to the next, droughts and floods have become commonplace around the world, hampering efforts to produce enough affordable food for its people. Wildfires and hurricanes like Superstorm Sandy are causing billions of dollars in damage and claiming hundreds of lives. And in developing nations, climate change is fundamentally altering entire societies. In Bangladesh, rising sea levels have forced thousands of, quote, environmental refugees to move inland, straining existing food supplies and inundating local job markets. In extreme cases, climate change has even caused horrific violence. Many point to the genocide in Sudan's Darfur region as one of the worst examples of a conflict stemming from scarce water supplies and a lack of fertile land. The world is learning how to cope with a warming climate, but managing those growing pains will be a key challenge for policymakers in Washington.
In Bangladesh, sea levels have risen. People have moved back off the coast there. Droughts have caused conflict. Some people say the conflict in Darfur was due to droughts there, and that even a shortage of water in Syria may have been a factor in starting the civil war there. People that are more alarmed about climate change say this shows a much bigger, more immediate problem.
If you actually look at Bangladesh, the Bangladesh Natural Science Academy actually tell us, and this is a little surprising, that the area of Bangladesh has been increasing overall, because while sea levels have been rising, and that, all other things equal, ought to mean that Bangladesh gets smaller, they also deposit about 600 million tons of silt from the rivers each year. So it's actually been growing about 50 square miles per year. Now, again, I'm not saying this, so no need to worry, but I'm simply saying we need to have better information about these things. And if you ask the Bangladeshis, what would they like us to focus on? Would they like us to reduce sea level rise by the end of the century by a tiny amount? Or would they like us to help them fix, for instance, the fact that a third of all Bangladeshis live with arsenic in their water? I think the latter is probably both the easier, the cheaper, and, quite frankly, a much bigger concern for them. On Darfur, yes, there's lots of people who pointed out that there's been a huge drought catastrophe in the Sahel region. That's been a big problem. But if you run the climate models, it actually turns out that 8 of the models show it would be happening, but 7 of the models show it shouldn't have been happening. So the fact is we don't right now know whether that's the case, but let's just assume that it will still happen because of global warming. And there's some evidence that indicate we're going to see more drought because of global warming. The problem I have with this argument is to say, so we're going to cut back carbon emissions. So yes, there'll still be more drought, but slightly less more drought by the end of the century. Instead of actually helping these people, there's been a population increase of about a doubling over the last 25 years in this region. Maybe we should help them find a better way both to find jobs, maybe also other livelihoods. We should also bring back greenery instead of the desert. There are lots of specific things that we could do at much lower cost to help them a lot more.
How long will the green energy be more expensive than fossil fuels?
It'll probably be for many decades, unfortunately. Remember, the cost of solar panels and wind turbines have come down dramatically over the last 20, 30, 40 years. So we are actually seeing a dramatic development, but there are 2 things that still need to happen. They also need to become even cheaper, and we need to find a way, what do we do when the wind isn't blowing and when the sun isn't shining? We need basic storage, and that actually turns out to be really difficult. In Europe, we get about 1% of our energy from wind. Although we've plastered over the continent with wind, we think we've got it down. But the reality is we haven't. The world gets about 1/3 of 1% of its energy from wind and a 200th or something of a percent from solar globally. So we're nowhere near this, and we're not going to anytime soon, because people forget that these technologies take time. Remember in 1890, we basically had electricity. Electricity is a fantastic technology, has great benefits for everyone individually, and yet we still haven't rolled out electricity around the world 120 years later.
Many, many people.
Yeah.
Germany had a massive project to shift away from fossil fuels and have more energy efficiency and more green energy sources.
Yes.
That has not worked very well.
Well, Germany is actually one of those places where they have significantly reduced their emissions. We're probably estimating about 13%. They've actually done something. Remember, it's also cost them a fortune. If you just look at the solar panels, we're estimating that they have committed to pay about $130 billion in subsidies for their solar panels, the ones that they have up right now. And the net impact of that is going to be postponing global warming by the end of the century by 37 hours. So the temperature
37 hours.
37 hours. So
there
the
must
temperature,
be Germans who disagree with you.
No. This is simply taking the ministry's own numbers of how much CO2 they have reduced and plugging into standard climate models. And that just underscores the current solutions are simply about feeling good. It's not about putting up these inefficient solar panels right now. It's about innovating the price of these solar panels down dramatically. So spending a lot more money on research and development into these green energy technologies, not just solar. There are lots of ideas out there. So we should be spending money on all these because researchers are cheap.
And then specifically in terms of President Obama's performance, there was initial push for a cap and trade legislation that failed. Was that a mistake? Do you think he could have done more in the beginning and could be doing more now?
If you look at the cap and trade legislation as it looked at the very end, it was a boondoggle in so many different ways. Even Jim Hansen, Al Gore's climate advisor, thought it was a terrible piece of legislation because essentially it worked a little bit on cutting carbon a little bit, and then the rest of the 1,000 pages was about how everybody was going to get money and federal subsidies, and we were going to get all this trading, all these windfall profits. Fundamentally, Doing this through the cap and trade method, which the European Union has also tried, ends up costing a huge amount of money, and you actually get very little cuts for it. It's not fundamentally about trying to do these kinds of cuts through cap and trade. It's about technology. So I would love to see, and Obama has also made those arguments, spend a lot more in research and development into green energy. Yeah, because that would actually work a lot. It doesn't make you feel as good because it's not going to happen next year. But if we could make green energy so cheap that in, say, 20 or 40 years it was cheaper than fossil fuels, we would have solved global warming because everyone would switch over, not just rich, well-meaning Americans, but also the Chinese and the Indians.
But skeptics say you should let the market drive that research and development, that government shouldn't be funding it. I mean, are there successful examples of government research really making breakthroughs in terms of?
You could certainly say fracking, for instance, was actually subsidized by DOE from 1970 up to the late 1990s and probably a little bit into 2000, where nobody thought it was going to work out, and certainly nobody could see the benefit of doing that. And so the general argument for government research and development is if something is far away for a breakthrough, it doesn't help you as a private company to invest a lot of money in it, because even if you make a breakthrough, you're not going to manage to be around and have your patent rights when the benefits start coming in. And that's why you need government research. This is why we have Nobel laureates and blue sky research. So the point here, sort of in a US context, is to not do the Solyndra. Solyndra was very much that you spent $500 million on production. No. But Solyndra had this potentially great idea of saying maybe we should make round solar panels. Great idea. Let's give them money for some researchers to look into that. And maybe in 10 or 20 years it'll be a great idea, but please, please, please don't build a factory for $500 million to produce them. So it's really the question of getting away from this, putting up lots of stuff that doesn't work now, and rather focus on the research.
And one last thing that Obama did, in the spring of 2013, he announced caps on emissions from power plants. That was by executive order. Was that a step forward?
As I understand, the big problem with this is going to be tied up in court for forever. But in principle, I think it's well-intentioned, basically carbon capture, that you're going to take the CO2 out of the emission stream and you're going to put it down in big holes. A lot of people that I talk with are telling me that's just never really going to work.
As the polar ice caps shrink, the once fabled Northwest Passage is now a reality. Sea lanes are open at the top of the world, at least for part of the year, and melting sea ice has exposed thousands of square miles of seabed for offshore drilling. With an estimated 13% of the world's untapped oil reserves and up to 30% of its natural gas hidden beneath the Arctic, the U.S., China, and 8 other countries have made bids for Arctic drilling rights. But critics charge that extraction of these fuels will only add to global warming. They fear the flood of new fuels will delay much-needed efforts to support renewable energies like wind and solar. But with fossil fuels still accounting for roughly 80% of global energy use, drilling in the Arctic may be a matter of economic necessity.
Another big thing that people cite in terms of an immediate problem is the polar ice cap, melting.
Yep.
Would you agree that that is happening? How much is that going to raise sea level?
Well, actually, the Arctic ice cap is melting significantly. That's not going to raise sea levels at all because it was already floating. It's the Greenland and it's the Antarctic that we're worried about. And actually, the sea ice around the Arctic has been increasing, which also makes us a little uncomfortable about our models because our models are underestimating the melt in the Arctic, but they're overestimating the melt, or they're actually not predicting the increase in the Antarctic. But fundamentally, yes, it is happening. Yes, it is a problem in some areas. Certainly it's going to be a problem for polar bears, and it's going to be a problem for some of the biodiversity in the area. Of course, when you actually go to Greenland, Greenland is a part of Denmark, they're like delighted. Which is not very surprising if you think about it. But again, so it emphasizes the idea that global warming is rarely just a bad thing for good things and a good thing for bad things. That's sort of a Disney version of global warming.
The Arctic is a good example of that. I think the US and China and Russia and several other countries have applied to actually start drilling in the Arctic. There's some estimates that 18% of the untapped natural gas reserves in the world are in the Arctic, roughly 30% of the oil. Should we be drilling there?
I think you should recognize that the Arctic is a much more vulnerable area, and so we should have better safeguards. But the idea of saying you shouldn't drill there is in some way just as silly as say, why shouldn't we drill in Saudi Arabia? I mean, if you're against fossil fuels, you're against fossil fuels.
But is it more environmentally sensitive in
yes,
the Arctic
yes.
than the deserts of Saudi Arabia?
In that way, we should have better regulation. But the only way you're going to get people to shift away from fossil fuels is if you make green energy cheaper. I mean, remember that fossil fuels are an amazing opportunity and a resource. I mean, we don't burn fossil fuels to annoy Al Gore, right? We burn it because it basically powers everything we like about civilization. So the reality here is we have lifted, China, for instance, over the past 30 years have probably lifted 680 million people out of poverty, not using wind turbines, but basically lots and lots of coal. Now, it has a negative impact from global warming. That's why we need to shift away. But we've got to recognize we're not going to do that by saying, don't do that. We're only going to manage to do that by coming up with better, smarter, cheaper green alternatives.
Should there be a sort of global treaty?
I think for a very long time, for about 20 years since the first Rio summit in 1992, everybody has wanted a global solution. I mean, this is a global problem. If the US just cuts back, it basically means the production is going to move somewhere else. We've moved a lot of our production to China and India and elsewhere, and that's not going to help for global warming. So there's a good argument for a global treaty. But we've tried for 20 years, and we've failed for 20 years. The Kyoto Protocol, which is the only treaty that's actually ever been agreed to, made almost no difference. We spent about 20 years negotiating and implementing it, and we estimate that by the end of the century it will have reduced temperatures so little that even with the finest thermometers you wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
Did it help though? Did it slow the increase of these?
Yes, it did slow, but we're talking about and I'm actually struggling just to do it right now. It's between 1,000 and a tenth of a thousandth of a degree Fahrenheit by the end of the century. So it's just simply not the way we're going to help global warming. We do need to fix global warming, but the way we're trying to do it right now has been proven to not work. Because you're essentially asking all nations, could you please reduce your emissions and hence your productivity, because that's what drives most economies today. Could you please switch to more expensive fuels, and then it's going to have a little benefit for everyone in 100 years. That's just a very, very hard bargain to come up with, and certainly to keep people agreeing to.
And that's the argument particularly from China and India. Look at the United States and Europe. Everyone has their own car. Why don't average Chinese and Indians deserve to have the same lifestyle?
Yeah.
And developed countries are essentially saying, sorry, we've got a global warming problem. You can't have your own car.
Yeah.
I mean, are the Indians and Chinese right?
But that's not really the issue for most Chinese and Indians, and especially Indians and most other poor people in Southeast Asia. Remember, about 1.6 billion people don't have access to any kind of electricity. About 3.2 billion people, almost half this world's population, cook and keep warm basically using twigs and dung. So it's not about getting out in the suburbs in the US. It's much, much more basic. They simply want a decent life. And so the simple answer to your question is twofold. First, you can say whatever you want. They are still going to do it. But what we can do, and I think that's where we need to get this to a solution-oriented understanding, it's not about saying you can't do that. It's about making sure that once they get a car and once they get a house, that it's powered eventually with green energy. We can't avoid you having a car. It's actually a great thing to have a car for most people, but we can make sure you get an electric car that's eventually powered by a wind turbine.
And just lastly, your latest book is How to Spend $75 Billion. There's other ways we can address some of these enormous problems we face in the United States and globally that might be wiser ways to spend money than constantly focusing on.
Well, I mean, we talked a little bit about it with Bangladesh, and if you go out and ask poor people around the world, what are you most worried about? They don't say, I'm worried about temperature rise in 100 years. I'm worried about more drought in 100 years. They're worried about their kids dying tonight, or not having enough food, or not getting an education. And so I simply want us to get a little bit of sense back in where can we get the most bang for our buck. And climate is one of the places where if we spend money smartly on research and development in green energy, we can actually do quite a bit of good in the long run. But let's remember, for most people, they're much, much more important and immediate problems that we can tackle much, much cheaper at much lower cost.
Thank you for joining us, Bjorn.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Come back for more on the great decisions that make our foreign policy. I'm David Rode. Thank you.
UN-sponsored conferences and treaties have long sought a reduction in global carbon emissions, but the world's leaders often don't see eye to eye on the issue. Developing nations argue that the largest polluters, like the US and China, bear the greatest burden in cutting emissions. They point out that the new economies rely heavily on fossil fuels to gain traction on a global stage, whereas modernized nations can afford to move away from the dirty fuels. Historically, the U.S. has disagreed with that logic, arguing that all nations should face a similar burden in protecting the environment. Congress famously refused to ratify the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. But in June 2013, President Obama announced a climate change initiative requiring the nation's power plants to significantly cut carbon dioxide emissions. Calling for more federal funding of renewable energy technologies, Washington seems to be reversing its resistance to climate policy. But many wonder if this shift is too little, too late. To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions in Foreign Policy, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org to start the discussion of U.S. foreign policy in your community. Find out how at www.greatdecisions.org/leader. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Reuters Television. Sponsorship of Great Decisions is provided by ENI, the Hereford Foundation, and PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP. China is the dominant power in Asia. Both an economic powerhouse and a political heavyweight, Beijing flexes serious muscle to ensure its interests in the region. At times, Chinese might comes as a welcome ally, making it easier for the U.S. to tackle crises like North Korea's nuclear ambitions. But Washington
Warming is happening.
Yes, I think virtually everyone tells us there is global warming, it's partly man-made, and it is an important problem. What I'm skeptical about is partly these sort of very alarmist arguments, we're going to see the kind of end of the world, but also the way we try to tackle it, which has fundamentally for the last 20 years been incredibly inefficient policies that cost a lot and will do almost no good.
We're here in New York. There was record drought in the United States. Recently, we've had these superstorms. Hurricane Sandy devastated this city. Others would say this is happening right now. This is a huge threat and immediate problem.
Temperature jumped 1.4 degrees. In the next, experts believe that number will soar as high as 11.5 degrees higher. A hotter planet means new challenges in securing the globe. Food and water will become scarce, and natural disasters will wreak havoc on government resources. The U.S. is getting ready, but it's not just the EPA spearheading efforts of climate reform. It's also the military, and on a global scale, governments continue to seek solutions that will mitigate the impact of climate change. The war on warming, next on Great Decisions.
Host David Rode. The Earth is getting hotter, and with the rising temperatures come new perils. Natural disasters cause destruction, death, and the migration of populations. They also threaten food security. The world's leaders are looking for solutions, but they don't always agree. Here with me today to discuss climate change is Bjorn Lomborg. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
You're known as sort of a skeptic about global warming. Your latest book is How to Spend $75 Billion. It's looking at other ways to spend money that might go into a sort of radical approach to countering global warming. Do you think global...
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we explore today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Reuters Television. Sponsorship of Great Decisions is provided by ENI, the Hereford Foundation, and PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP.
Hello and welcome to Great Decisions. I'm your host. Problem we should be devoting, billions of dollars to, and our leaders should be doing more.
Yep.
Are you sure this is not an immediate crisis?
Well, you're absolutely right. A lot of people would say, first of all, it's happening, and we should do something about it. Let me take both of those points. When the scientists look at, for instance, hurricanes and drought, they can't actually tell that it's changing just yet. Let's just remember there was a lot of drought in the 50s. There was much, much more drought in the 1930s in the US. And of course, we have data back to the 1200s that show there's mega drought for 6 decades. So while we have an idea that probably drought